Hey historians, welcome back. This is Miss V and we're back talking about history. In this case, we are discussing the last part of industrialization, which is industrialization in Japan and the Meiji restoration. This is guided notes 10.4, the last guided notes in this unit of industrialization. So let's get started. Alright, so these are our standards here. We're looking to describe the technological innovations and those agricultural innovations that happen specifically in Japan this time. Alright, and here we go. So our first answer, so before the arrival of Matthew Perry in the United States, Japan was for the most part isolated from the Western world for about 200 years. Okay, they did not have much interaction with the Western world in terms of trade. Yes, somewhat, but not so much. Okay, they viewed foreigners as foreigners, as outsiders. They were very ethnocentric. Ethno meaning ethnicity and centric meaning central. So they were very specific to their own ethnicity and not allowing Japanese to travel outside of their nation, and also, which is your answer for number one, not allowing foreigners to come in to in their nation, right? However, at the advent of the 19th century, which is the 1800s, the United States and Europe are looking for markets so that they can sell their goods. And then also Japan realized that they kind of have to open up their borders a bit so that they can engage in further trade and not be left behind, right? So they started to open up their borders just a little bit. And that mostly happened during the Industrial Revolution. Of course, we talked about the Columbian Exchange and so forth. They did do some minute training with the West, with other countries in Asia, but not so much the Western world in terms of Europeans and the United States. Okay. All right. So this is number two. Commodore Matthew Perry, when he did approach Japan, Matthew Perry of the United States gave them a letter, and his letter was asking, and as you see here, asking is in quotations because asking in this case wasn't really asking. It was a direct threat, okay, to Japan, and it was basically saying that they wanted to open trade with, or having them open trade with the United States, right? Again, the United States did not come there and with a kumbaya, hey, let's trade, kind of thing, and asking, or having a nice ask. This was a very hard, deliberate, threatening ask to open trade. Okay. And of course, Americans and Europeans wanted to trade their goods and then also use Japan to help resupply their ships as they traveled in the Pacific area. Okay, so that's number two. All right, number three. What was the name of the treaty that opened the ports to the United States? So the Japanese shoguns were very impressed with Americans and how they use this sense of force on them to make them trade, per se. They saw it as, how can I say, authoritative, okay? Because the Japanese shoguns, their style, and if you remember, we talked about the samurai and the daimyo and the shoguns and the type of Japanese empire before, right? Their type of style was very authoritative, okay? And they admired that in the American government or American society, or Matthew Perry. So of course, Japan, seeing an opportunity here to trade as well and to get further ahead, they agreed to open up their ports, and they signed the Treaty of Kanagawa. Okay, and that gave trading rights to the United States, and then eventually Britain, France, and Russia will also get trading rights because of this treaty. Okay, so that was number 3. All right. Okay, so this treaty had a big impact on Japan. So now, because of this treaty, the shoguns, their power weakened, because now they sort of gave in to the foreign society, right? Now, because of them moving more towards trading with Westerners, now Japan had to modernize and become industrialized, which was a series of process called Westernization, right? If you recall, we talked about that during absolutism when we talked about Russia. Russia went through this form of Westernization, right? Japan did the same thing, but it happened later for them here during the 1800s and the 19th century, right? Where they started to modernize and industrialize in order to compete with these Western governments. Okay, and as you see here, number 4, your answer for number 5, what was the Meiji Restoration? This was an emperor that came in 1868 and established himself as the leader of Japan and began this more enlightened, right, westernized movement for Japan. Okay, so they are changing their society and changing their scope of their society politically, economically, and socially to fit a more Western perspective of commerce, right? So that they can compete with the West, with US and Europe, and not fall back and have their society isolated anymore. Okay, so that's 4 and 5. All right, so this is number 6. The emperor sent some advisors to Western nations so that they can study their governments, study how the economy was changing, especially because of industrialization, study the new technology that they had, and the new customs. Foreign experts were also sent or invited into Japan so that they can train their former samurai and their former daimyo and so forth in order to meet the needs of westernization and industrialization, right? So if you remember before, we talked about samurai. That was the sort of military, right, during imperial Japan, right? But now that they're moving towards westernization, that totally changed. In a good way. If you have time, check it out. It's a great movie. A little historical, well, a lot of historically incorrect. There was a good bit of it that was historically incorrect, but nonetheless, the storyline is quite good. Okay, because there is some aspects here where you see the change and how Japan's society drastically changed from imperial Japan to a more westernized Japan when the last samurai, who was played by Tom Cruise, comes in. And hopefully you get to see that in class, but if not, I'll have the link so you can see the movie clip or the movie trailer, and hopefully when you get a chance, check it out, because I think it will be a really good experience for you to see that change. All right, and it was a really good movie as well. All right, so here we go with 7, 8, and 9. Okay, what happened when the Japanese abolished the feudal order? So when the Japanese abolished the feudal order, administrative districts were replaced, okay, because now they're doing away with feudalism. They were kind of one of the last nations to still kind of hold on to feudalism. Remember, Russia did away with that a long time ago, right? So now they're replacing all of their feudal systems or feudal domains with administrative districts. The daimyo were removed from power. So the daimyo, remember, those were your nobles and so forth. They're no longer in power, right? And the samurai class is abolished. The samurais are gone. And that took a toll on the culture of Japan's society, because a lot of those older Japanese that believed in Imperial Japan were very upset with the destruction or the deconstruction of the samurai class, because the samurai class again were the protection of the Imperial Japan, right? And now samurais were now replaced with military. Okay. They also adapted, as you see here, number 8. What type of government was set up? They set up a constitutional monarchy, which was based a lot on the German model. And they had a legislature. Okay. And then number 9, what power did the emperor have? The emperor in this case did have some power, unlike Great Britain, where the king or queen had very limited power, very limited power. Here, the emperor still had some authoritative power, especially commanding the armed forces, naming the prime minister, and appointing the cabinet. Okay. They did recognize some individual rights. However, suffrage, the right to vote, was still very limited, where only 5% of the population could vote. Okay, so they still maintain some aspects of authority and monarchy per se in industrial Japan. Okay, whereas in Imperial Japan, it was much more authoritative and much more monarchical, right, in terms of power. All right, so that's 7, 8, and 9. All right, number 10 and 11. Number 10, what did the Japanese government do after they built factories? So the Meiji government did their best to westernize methods and industrialize Japan. So they're trying to use the Western methods to update their machinery, industrialize Japan so that they can compete with these European and US governments, right? So what they did is that the government would build factories, and then they would sell those factories to Japanese businessmen, and they were known as zaibatsu, right? And the zaibatsu would then be in the hands of these wealthy businessmen. And of course, those businessmen would then go on to fund things like, as you see here, number 11, they would help to fund things like the banking system and railroads and build ports and so forth. So that was the kind of turn hand, give and take system that they developed. So by the time we got to the late 19th century, which is the 1890s, in Japan, the economy was strong, the population grown tremendously, and a lot of peasants that were farmers, a lot of rice farmers and so forth, began moving into the major cities to try to look for jobs. In the same way that happened in Europe, same way that happened in the US, it's the same thing that happened here in Japan in terms of urbanization. Okay, so that's 10 and 11. So as you see here, this is how Japanese trade just skyrocketed after industrialization. As you see here, it started out late, but once it did start in the late 19th century, it skyrocketed, okay, in terms of getting millions of yen, right? All right, so this is number 12. Which countries did Japan admire when it came to their army and navy? Of course, again, the samurai were no longer the warriors in Japan, so they had to replace their protection. Japan did admire the discipline of the German army, and they admired the skill of the British army, so they patterned their military off of those two nations. So all men, notice that, now, not if you choose to, all men had to join the military. Okay, all men did. All men had to join the military. Again, I ask you to watch The Last Samurai. You will get to see a lot of that in practice or acted out, so you can actually see and feel and visualize how industrial Japan was like, right? And Japan built this really strong army and strong navy, and that's going to be a factor later when we talk about imperialism and we get into World War I. Okay, so keep that in mind as well. So like I said, everything is going to build up to each other. Everything is connected at this point, right? Okay, so this is number 13. Why did Japan become an imperialistic power? They transformed themselves into this major world power because of industrialization, and now they're using their military strength to seek out new nations to conquer and use their resources. Why? Because if you look at Japan, Japan itself is an island. Okay, so if Japan is an island itself, that means that their resources, their raw materials, and their markets are going to be very limited. Okay, so the only way for them to be able to gain these new raw materials and gain new markets, they have to seek other places to either form some kind of relationship and trade, or they're going to conquer them. And what they turn to? They turn to conquer a lot of these smaller nations around them so that they can have control of their resources. Okay, and that's what happened with number 13. They were looking for new colonies for their raw materials and their new markets, and that in itself is the cause of imperialism, as you see here, where you have a militaristically dominant country taking control of another country by force. Okay, and hopefully you remember that, because we're going to get into that unit very soon. Okay, all right, so I said, as you see here, everything is connected. It moves one thing to another. All right, I know this is a lot for number 14, but we're going to summarize the Sino-Japanese War in 2 steps, I guess. We'll try to do it. So again, remember that Japan became more imperialistic. So Japan basically tries to expand and go into Korea. China goes into war with Japan because China had control over Korea. Okay, of course Japan is way more industrialized than China at this point. Japan wins the war, so Japan gets Taiwan, they get some ports in China, and they also get Korea as a protectorate of Japan. And a protectorate is basically a nation state or a nation that is somewhat controlled or is protected by the dominant country. Okay, so basically Japan is now protecting and using some of the resources from Korea, since they won that Sino-Japanese War. So that's it in a nutshell. Japan wanted Korea. China said, no, it's ours. China lost because they don't have the manpower. Japan gets Taiwan, some of the ports in China, and Korea. End of story. Okay? And that's about it for the Sino-Japanese War. Alright? Alright, and this is number 15. The Russo-Japanese War. What happened here? So both Japan and Russia had interest in Korea, right? with the Sino-Japanese War, Russia refused to recognize Japan's rights over Korea. So Japan was like, okay, well, we're going to be big dogs and we're going to surprise attack Russia, okay? However, Russia did not realize the might of Japan's army and their navy, and Japan literally destroys their navy, and they drive the Russians out of Korea. So Russia is forced to withdraw from Korea, and now Japan becomes this massive, major military power because they defeated Russia. End of story. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so again, just to recap all of this, Japan and Russia both interested in Korea. Russia says, nah, I'm not recognizing that you had control of Korea. Japan was like, whoa, I don't care. And they surprise attack. They jump on the Russians. Russia is defeated. They're like, okay, we're going to back out. So they back out of Korea. And now Japan is seen as the big dog, militaristically. Okay? End of story. Hopefully you get that. Alright. This is number 16 and 17. Again, as you see here, their dependence as a world market. Okay? Japan's economy was dependent on trade. They needed the new world markets. Like I mentioned in the beginning, even though they were isolated from the Western world, they realized that they had to open up their borders and include the Western world because they were an island and they lacked so many natural resources in order to keep their society and government thriving, right? So they had to open up their borders. They had to engage in industrialization in order to keep their society going, okay? So because of that, they turned to, and in order to compete with Western cultures and with Western countries such as the United States, Germany, Britain, and so forth, they had to become imperialistic so that they can have control of those I wouldn't say smaller, but those other countries that had the natural resources that they needed. Okay? And that's what made Japan very imperialistic, and a lot of the other countries that I just mentioned, United States, Britain, Germany, and France, and some other European countries are going to be highly imperialistic because they need those raw materials. They need those natural resources. All right, which leads us into the next unit of imperialism. All right, so hopefully you get that idea. This is the activity that you need to answer those questions based on this photo and what we talked about with the Meiji Restoration and industrialization in Japan. And I will see you in the next unit. Have a good one.